Welcome back. We are now in a different system, and there's a few too many toys to play with. Jamie's setting everything up today, so let's make sure that we give him, a bit of a run up. I'm sure you're happy with that.
Very happy about that. There's no more, are there? We're not going to.
I'm not going to play with any more toys at all. But I haven't got an intro stinger for us, so I'm just going to have to do it myself.
Resistance is futile.
So there we go. We're in.
How long is this podcast? How long are we doing this for?
Just got longer.
I quit.
Resistance is futile.
Welcome to the podcast,
where we explore what's happening with AI, business, automation and culture, and ask,
where on earth is all this going? I'm not going to play with any more toys, I promise.
Yeah, sit on your hands, please, folks.
I have got canned laughter. I'm not going to use it. People in our audience, or one of them, will just disappear.
Yeah, that's it. Let's stay on track. Actually, I'd just like to point out, I hadn't realised that I think with the reverse, I've got an AI jumper. Look at that. Does it show? Is it reversing it on the camera? It's actually LA.
It hasn't. But yeah, you'd have to mirror it at your end. But we can
totally
do that
useless for the people listening. So it's
little bonus for people watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so
what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about what I guess will be called, I think, a Napster moment, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But effectively, this is the lawsuit, the case that New York Times Group are taking against OpenAI. So what's happening is they've filed a lawsuit against OpenAI to say that OpenAI's large language model, that's billions and billions of data points that was trained on the internet, was trained partly on New York Times data, because it surfed around the internet looking at every single website and ingested that data. And New York Times have been doing some testing and research and found that it absolutely has been trained on some of that data. If they put in certain prompts, and we'll get onto this in a second, it absolutely shows that it is from direct articles from the New York Times. And so
what's the
OpenAI
implications, though? I mean, for somebody who's new to this and thinking, so what, people use the internet to search for stuff, why can't robots do this? For somebody who's wondering what the implications are, what are they?
So the implications are that who owns data, or who owns information. This is intellectual property and copyright. So who owns information? Who has the right to use that information? I think using is probably a broad term for ingesting or learning from or just reading. And how is that data then being used? So Google here is a kind of great example. Funnily enough, I was at a talk yesterday that I gave, and it was full of much older and wiser people than me from all different backgrounds. And actually the guy that invited me, who's an old client of mine, is an IP lawyer. So obviously this was a topic of conversation. And he was saying exactly the same thing was happening back when Google started. And I think what's interesting about this is that all of these news organizations and all this information, people wanted to be on Google because it was good for them. They got traffic and it was all great. So actually it all worked out okay. But now we're trying to see what is the difference between Google doing what it does, because Google does exactly the same thing all the time. It's constantly crawling through websites, looking at the content, so that when you search for, an article about, Donald Trump or something, it will appear on, a link to the New York Times.
Exactly. And if we'd maybe crushed the ability of Google to do that early on through lawsuits, would we be happy with that? Do we not like the way that Google works? Is it that kind of comparison, or is it something else?
Yeah, no, I think it is. But I think that where New York Times have got their knickers in a twist is that they're saying that it's not just it. So with Google, you're searching for something and you click on the link and it takes you to New York Times. Yeah,
that's
so you
true.
Search for something, it takes you to the website. Whereas OpenAI and other AI models are reading the information, ingesting that information, then using it to come up with new answers, and not necessarily citing that it's coming from New York Times. So there's a kind of revenue side here. There's if Google puts traffic to New York Times, they can monetize that. New York Times can monetize that. But I think what they're saying now is that, hold on, OpenAI is reading this information, ingesting it, using it to produce new information, and hey, we're not getting anything.
And saying, look,
this.
Yeah, exactly. So that you can't have a future in which there is a answer for everything, but you don't know where it's come from, and nobody's getting any revenue from it. If we want to continue with that version of an economic payout for IP.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, basically, it goes right to the heart of, if you make knowledge available for somebody and you want to charge for it, it's now closing that gate in
Yes.
many ways, if it's allowed
Yeah.
to continue.
Yeah, and I guess if you were to think further down the line of this, and what OpenAI are doing, is OpenAI are starting now to cite, but when you do a search now, it's starting to say searching Bing, and then it comes back with things, and it cites it, and you can click on the link, and it will take you to the thing. But it's a small citation right at the very end, with a number, as if you'd see on a paper, you'd see it, with a little thing. It's not like very clearly this is New York Times. And sometimes it's not going to cite it because there's two elements of this. There's the side where it's going, where you say, can you tell me about the article that was in New York Times? Then it uses the citation. But there's the other thing where you might say, tell me about, I don't know, Donald Trump's rise. I don't know why I'm obsessed with Donald Trump, by the way. Just he's front of mind at the moment.
He's going to be front of mind, I think, all year. But okay, yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about how Donald Trump rose to power. Now, what
He's an AI.
OpenAI is then... Yeah. I saw a picture of him yesterday, and he did look like he'd been embalmed. It was a little bit shiny. But what that's doing is looking at New York Times, it's looking at Wikipedia, it's looking at, all the information, just like we do, and then it's bringing that all together and giving you an explanation, either as if you're a 12-year-old or explain it to me in bullet points or whatever. So there you won't get the citation. And I think that's what's annoying New York Times.
And I think what it goes to the heart of is the structure that we've got expects to always be able to capture people's attention and drive them somewhere else, right? Now,
Yep.
New York Times in particular, but news media outlets everywhere, their job is to capture our eyeballs and to drive us to some sort of either paywall or advertising or whatever. And
Yep.
in their case, it's really, yes, they're using copyright as the mechanism and their right to do it, to say, hey, hang on, stop, this is valuable stuff that we've provided. That's fair enough. But it goes right to the heart of the attention economy, in which capturing people's attention and diverting it so that you can make money out of it is under threat. Because hoovering up all of this information and just literally giving it to you may actually turn out to be what people want. And so that would involve an entirely different model of revenue. So yeah.
No, I was going to say, talking about eyeballs, I think OpenAI want the eyeballs because
There's a turf war going on.
That's going to be their revenue. That's going to be their revenue generation.
Yeah, so having the eyeballs like Google did early on, then they can work out what to do with it later. And whether that turns into a service at the moment, which is what it is, you just pay an amount every month. Just a monthly service, would mean also the end of advertising because individuals are paying for it. And it's interesting to recall that early on, the internet was considered to be a user pays model. There wasn't necessarily and obviously going to be an advertising model. So it may be that this time round we end up in a situation like that, but it's going to have to get through these hurdles first. And I wonder what the outcome will be. So if you're saying that it's not quite like Google search early on because you're not attributing, and giving revenue to people who have made that information available. What is it like if this new model does work out? Would it be links where the information's come from that you click on? What can you picture it being like if it does work out?
We talked about Napster very briefly at the beginning. So if everyone who's listening to this remembers, and by the way, I'd recommend there's a great series on Netflix all about Spotify, and it explains all this and makes you remember it. So let's go back in time to when we used to have CDs, and then some of us might rip those CDs to MP3s so that we could listen to them on our devices and computers and things like that. Then people started making those MP3s available through things like LimeWire and Napster. And the companies, the Sony Records or whatever, got absolutely nuts, or went absolutely nuts. They're saying, hold on a second, we're not getting paid for our content here, and our artists are, not so much our artists are getting paid, we're not getting paid. And so Spotify saw this opportunity. And actually, it's very interesting in the show about Spotify, in that initially it was this kind of utopian idea that they would have where the artists would get paid directly. Actually, the only way they were able to make it work was working with the big boys and on a kind of licensing model, and that's why you pay a subscription to Spotify, and look at the success of that. And I think that this is a Napster moment with OpenAI, because I think the only way that this is going to work is we are going to pay a subscription to OpenAI. OpenAI in turn will pay money to people like the New York Times or whatever on probably on their terms, because New York Times are going to want to get eyeballs and they're going to want to get their content. And I think that's how it's going to work. That's
obvious
what
thing,
I reckon.
if it's comparable at all to music, the obvious thing is you get big tentpole artists that are able to, of course, get the attention of people because they were already there, if that makes sense, like New York Times, right? So they're obviously seen as an authority. So, of course, ChatGPT, OpenAI, any other player in this space wants to use them as a source because they rank under the existing system. But what happens over time? Do you end up with it being harder to be recognized as a source for AI? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you get new information into that ecosystem? Because in music, I'm not saying that, there's not a complaint about modern music. It is what it is. But you have a different landscape than for new and independent artists emerging than you did 20, 30 years ago, where you had the live scene was the platform that you jump off into record labels and so on.
Yeah, whereas now with music, it's the other way around, isn't it? They don't make that much money from Spotify, or they definitely don't make much money from records and CDs anymore. They make their money from unique live performances where you're paying what feels like an arm and a leg to go and see an artist just because it's a moment that can't be replicated digitally in that very moment. And I wonder whether, I like your analogy of the kind of the tempo where, New York Times has all this great content and everything, and that will appear within the OpenAI stuff and be part of the subscription thing. Whereas you and I produce amazing content, but we're just Jamie and Dave, and we're not going to get paid for that. But it still has a value, And it's so what's going to happen to the smaller producers, not artists? Well, I suppose artists, because that's another conversation. But how are they going to get paid? And then I guess, whereas musicians are able to make their money from live performances, someone who's a great journalist or a great content provider, I think, Dave, you've written a book. You've written a book, you can sell a book, but how we can't, Dave live reading his book, I'd go.
Even Jamie are making great content either. But but you're right, these things have cycles that are probably bigger than most of our memories. But the fact is that it won't be the end of it. Put it this way, I think the argument that's being used a lot, I see, over this is, this will be the end of AI. It's going to crush AI. There'll be no point to it. And it's like people who are saying that have very short memories about how these things normally work out. In fact, it's a power play by the old school just to stay in the game. And it's also a power play by these new guys to basically get this out into the wild as quick as possible to test it out and see where the weak points are and then negotiate. It's a classic case of smash and grab or move fast and break things and then apologize afterwards and go, sorry, now let's work it out. So, this is not going away just because of that. I don't think there's a legal end to AI, at least. At least that's my impression, for better or worse. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, again, I'd refer back to the Napster thing, which is, the old school, the Sonys or the whoever's, who were fighting, tooth and nail to stop this from happening. But the cat was out the bag. It's the wave is here. AI is here. There is no doubt. It is, large corporations, smaller businesses, every media, everyone is talking about this and is starting to use it. You can't put this back now. And so they're either going to have to go along with it. The only people I imagine who are going to make money in this lawsuit are going to be the lawyers, as usual, in terms of how this runs. But what was interesting, so today we're recording, it was the day of the World Economic Forum at Davos. And Sam Altman was there. Benioff from Salesforce was there. Jeremy Hunt was on stage. I don't know what.
Okay.
Whatever your politics, I'm sure he's a lovely man.
So no one big then?
No.
But yeah.
So he was there. So
what did
they
Sam
addressed
Altman have
this.
to say? Was he asked about this?
Yeah, absolutely he was. And he said, and it was quite funny, he emphasized that OpenAI doesn't really need large data sets from New York Times because it's done all its training already and doesn't need, it was basically a bit of a kind of like, you know what?
Yeah,
I don't think we really need. Yeah, it was.
Like, well, we've already done the smash and grab.
That's right. And then he
we've
then
already
wanted to
stolen
say
more stuff from you. There's no point in asking for it back now.
Yeah, that's it. And then he also went on to say that actually their research is now more focused on smaller amounts of high quality data, which I thought was really good because it really was a bit of a kind of, high quality data. We just want smaller amounts. You're not really it was a bit of a dig. It was done in a very kind of passive aggressive way. He did it with his nice Sam Altman smile, and it came across like, oh, that's a nice thing to say. But really, there was a dig there as to what was going on.
If Pixar was making a movie in which there was a character that owned an AI company that was really nice, it would look exactly like Sam Altman.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, he looks like a Pixar cartoon. It's amazing.
Yeah. No, he seems like a nice guy. Here we go. I thought you were going to press your magic button there.
Oh, no. Do you want me to?
Yeah. There we go.
It's the only toy I've worked out yet. There's going to be more.
God help us. Next week, there's going to be... we're going to be inundated.
I promise I'll be nice.
So the other thing is that OpenAI, Sam Altman said that they are looking to forming kind of official partnerships for specific news content, and they're currently negotiating with other publishers, excluding New York Times.
And so that's what it's set up, really, isn't it? And in the same way, I mean, look, I'm on the side of people who've made valuable stuff. They should be getting paid for it. But I'm also aware that these disruptive forces, unless you just legislate them completely out, and we talked about this earlier on, this idea of for instance, nuclear weapons, which are different because they're not as accessible, of course, and only states can really be in the game. But nonetheless, super dangerous things have been legislated, so it's very hard to use them as consumers, you would hope. I don't think we've seen any nuclear weapons used yet by Joe Bloggs who bought something at Walmart, and hopefully never will. But in this case, it's cat out of the bag stuff. And how other media companies now respond, they'll see this and go, aha, this is the leverage that we needed to negotiate better for being included in this ecosystem. So it doesn't benefit anybody in the long run. But in the short run, it looks like you're giving AI or OpenAI a wallop, but I don't think it does. A bit like how we saw the contracts for the Writers Union, the Writers Guild, in the States. That was seen as a triumph, and it is in the short run, but all it means is those actors won't necessarily be used in that way, but others around the world will be, because others will see it and go, this is an opportunity for us to put our, Bollywood Guild into the mix and say we'll allow all of our actors in this body who've signed up to it to have their likenesses used, for example. So I don't know if the legal thing, it's a bit whack-a-mole, don't you think?
I think it is, because there was an item a few months ago about I'm totally uncool, so there was some new cool artist, some lady that does some kind of singing, and she had said basically, because all this AI music that's coming out now, the kind of Beatles used a little bit of it, and you can now get John Lennon singing Wonderwall and that kind of thing. And this artist came out and said, you know what, you use me, create AI stuff. All I ask is that I get 50% of whatever royalties. Now, and I think that's what's going to happen, is you're going to get people who can exploit this. They can use this to their advantage. And actually, this brings on to another, I think, interesting point. And I suspect this may be where this goes. I think we've talked in a previous podcast, we've touched very lightly on kind of NFTs and the kind of murky world of NFTs. And whilst I'm no great expert on them or advocate or not advocate of them, the idea of them in principle, if I understand it correctly, is that an NFT is a kind of digital token attached to the thing, the piece of music or the art or whatever, and therefore it gets tracked. You can track. If I produce a picture, I can NFT it, if that's the correct term, and then wherever that goes, if it gets sold, wherever it moves, there's a transaction log of what happens. Yeah,
like it's a digital watermark is the best metaphor I've heard of, in which you can, you know exactly who that digital asset belongs to forever. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this may be how this all gets resolved.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think it will be, whether it's a news article, anything digital, effectively, that can be consumed by AI learning. When that gets consumed, it gets tracked, and when it gets tracked, it can be monetized. And I think that will happen with artists. It will happen with bits of music. I think this is
with tiny
where
payments
NFT comes into the
and if your little sample of music or something gets used, several billion times because it gets put in loops, your quids in. And so I think, and that would allow for a lot of creativity in a space because people will just try stuff and put it out. I suppose in the same way that early, say, YouTubers perhaps were quids in, early Twitter users were the same for just simply for existing and making stuff.
Yes.
So I think that would be an ecosystem that would fill up pretty quick in that model.
As well, the other side of this is where, not just from the artist point of view, from a more commercial business point of view, is that you we've talked about this I think briefly, but you as a person could be NFT'd, because then if you wanted to have Dave Fultz, the video producer, and you want to have training with him, and it's a deep fake, and it's AI Dave, then effectively you could sell yourself, Dave. You could sell your soul. And
actually, I think you're right in the opposite sense of that. Where the value comes then is in that person in person, because they're responding to your direct needs. Now, you might create an AI of me, which is funnier, but do you really want to be around that one? Probably. Okay, I'm not really making a good argument here, but
well, I mean, go on. Sorry, go on.
What I was thinking was, for instance, I mean, in the video production side of business that I do, the main thing that I do is help people get on camera because it's terrifying for a lot of them, and to do it in a way that's natural and so on. But it's like, why bother? Well, because it builds trust and familiarity. Now, if you're selling a widget, that doesn't matter. But if you're selling something that is deeply personal, like your personal finance or perhaps some life coaching or something like that, you're going to need to trust that person. You're going to need to know it's actually them and responding to you, even if it's a copy of them through a video, that it was actually them. And so trust and familiarity in that space, I think, becomes super important. You can have an AI that might do some support functions, but you still need to actually turn up. And if you turn up in the right places, that's incredibly valuable to people, and they'll pay for it happily because they want that expertise.
What we're talking about with it goes to what we're talking about with the artist. If I want to see Dave live, I'm going to have to pay the premium for it.
But and exactly. And I think, but it's fun to do it. You're in a world or a community that understands what that artist's unique perspective is, and you're joined from that. So you're paying for that experience of joining with those people. And if you're not doing it often, then it's something you want to save for. It makes sense. Yeah, and I can totally see how that works for fans of, artists that are maybe second or third tier, but you're still paying a lot of money for them. Because they're unique. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm optimistic that this is not a Skynet or even close to Skynet moment. This stuff is the usual wranglings of big tech when it enters a new space and disrupts everything.
Yeah, I agree, and I think. Sorry, I just keep bumping the mic. I also think, I was curious. I haven't looked, but I'm not sure how big, value-wise, and how much cash they've got in their pockets, New York Times are, because obviously you've got OpenAI, who've billions and billions, backed majoritarily by Microsoft. Now, Microsoft have a massive vested interest in OpenAI, and I don't know if you saw this on the news, but that Microsoft actually, for the first time, went past Apple.
I saw that.
Of their valuation as one of the biggest companies. So, they have a vested interest in keeping OpenAI going and having it as clever as possible and learning as much as possible. So I'm sure New York Times know that they are really taking on a lot by bringing this fight.
Yeah, that's it. And I do think they open themselves up to being superseded by others that will just crack a deal rather than take them on legally. But it sets a precedent, and of all the big publications that was going to do it, it makes sense that it's New York Times, I would have thought. And they're proper old school media. They have an old school approach to things, and so it is a showdown of old world versus new. And look, I don't always think that the new world is best or should win.
No.
And there's lots of things that are traditional that get stampeded that aren't necessarily better. But in this case, and I'm not sure what's better, but I do think that if it disrupts a lot of old models to do with the media, that may be good. I don't know for sure, but the old model of the media in which we end up in these silos of editorial that force us to only consume certain diets, maybe that can get broken up too. Because if one thing I've noticed that OpenAI does, I don't know if it's better, but it breaks up your thinking simply because it has to be quite vanilla.
Yeah.
It doesn't come back with massive opinions.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting because especially with this year being a big year for kind of elections and, everyone's talking about AI and elections and the media, the mainstream media, and the impact that has in terms, or influence, that has on people's votes. It will be interesting to watch over time if you possibly get a more nuanced argument when you're trying to work out, or understand about a particular political party or a movement or something like that. It will be interesting. I mean, it brings up then about, how is the AI trained and how is it influenced itself? But, it does feel a little bit more fair than, some great big media company just trying to force something down your throat.
It's just safe. Even when you try to steer it off down, polemic sort of avenues where you say, no, I want you to be, XYZ, it'll play that role for a bit, and then you'll notice that the guardrails come up quicker now than they might have before. So I think that's a whole issue that we should tackle at some point, is how these black boxes getting constructed to make cultural, defining conversations with people, because over time, an entire generation of people listening to vanilla ChatGPT answers we're going to lose the edge of having and understanding different points of view, like really, how to put it, extreme points of view, which help to frame contextually what's going on. You need to hear them, and so you can't have an endless vanilla set of answers that ChatGPT get. But those guardrails at the moment, that seems like they're working hard on. Okay, but I see other problems with that down the line. I'm just culturally, I tend to prefer that culturally we have roughage in our diet, if that's a good metaphor for it, so that we don't end up just eating, a slurry every day of porridge. You can't. You've got to have fibre. You've got to have grains, nuts, and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, that's my take.
That's a good analogy. I like that. I like the roughage of life.
The rough with the smooth. So yeah. So I don't know where that leads us, but what was the outcome, do you think, from the Davos meeting? Was there any kind of agreements or is it still ongoing? Because I don't follow Davos or
no, nor do I. And I was listening to it whilst I was doing something else as well. So what the thing that I thought was quite interesting is that Benioff, isn't it, the Salesforce guy? Benioff, sorry, is the Salesforce guy, and it's really funny because he's a very sales-driven guy, right? Compared to Sam Altman, he's very chilled and laid back, and so it seemed that everything that came out of Mark Benioff's mouth was driven towards why the Salesforce AI was the best thing in the world, and their customers love it and it's fantastic. It was very kind of pitchy, whereas Sam Altman wasn't like that at all. But one thing I did pick up on was that they're very open about the fact that they don't really know how it's all working. It's this kind of crazy idea. And Sam Altman's like, there was talk about, disasters and talk about what happens if this happens. And they're like, let's hope there's not a disaster. Let's just hope it all works out okay. And you're like, this feels a bit uncomfortable,
There's going to be one. And I won't pretend to know what it is. But we'll look back on those sorts of conversations and think, what were we thinking? And I think there's we all often default to talking about ChatGPT because people are familiar with it and OpenAI generally. But of course, there are other players in the background making the stuff. And of course, there's an entirely different culture of it in China, an entirely different culture of it in Russia, entirely different culture in India. Have you followed any of the other big players, whether it's here or overseas, and seen any different approaches to OpenAI if we can get out of that bubble?
Not so
Anything
much overseas.
That catches your eye?
I've played around with. I do keep trying to jump back to Google because Google is a massive player here with Bard, and also with Mustafa Suleiman's one, Pi, I think it's called. I can't remember.
Is it Anthropic? He did
Anthropic
mention it.
Yeah. So I do try and play it, but I have to say I keep coming back to ChatGPT. Maybe it's familiarity. I don't know. Maybe I'm just used to it now. The app's on my phone in a certain place. My muscle memory has gone to there now. And I don't necessarily think it's that much better. I've not, with the other ones I've played with do give a different response, but I find myself wanting it to be better. So whenever I go onto one of these other ones to try them out, I'm trying to be open-minded, but when it comes back, I'm like, that's not as good. Is it?
Okay, so for you, OpenAI is advanced way above the others.
It has,
Yeah.
but I've had a strange experience with OpenAI over the last few weeks, or last couple of months actually, and I'd like to share it with you. Are you okay to talk about this? We're gonna go
Share
quite deep
away. Here we go.
Okay, thank you.
I need some more sound effects, don't I?
Yeah. We need something for a serious moment. Like a
Not that?
not that. No.
Okay. All right. I haven't got anything serious. Sorry about that.
Move away from the control deck. Dave.
Yeah.
Move away. Hands off. Okay, so here's the thing. And someone else touched on it in one of the groups that I'm on. So if you remember, there was the whole thing with Sam Altman being kicked out of the board or kicked off the board.
Yeah, that was weird. We didn't do a podcast on that because it was all too strange. But yeah.
It was very strange. It all happened very quickly, and that happened. Then he came back, and then Microsoft were going to move in, and all this kind of stuff. Or he was going to work for Microsoft, and I think it's had a strange effect on me. I've become a little disenchanted by OpenAI. It's really weird. I can't explain it. It's probably totally off topic of this podcast, but yeah, I was, as you know, I'm a bit of an OpenAI fanboy, and talk about it all the time, jumping up and down, excited by it. I felt like I'd been a bit jilted. It was very strange. Yeah.
Because culturally you thought you'd bought into a culture that was, on
I don't know.
Surface level at least, trying to do the best for everybody.
Partly to do the best for everyone. You felt like you're all in this together, and you're part of this thing, this new gang.
Okay. I'm way too cynical for that. I thought it was... I thought it was just corporate America, to be honest.
Maybe, but no, they had me. And and even now, I love it and I use it, but I'm definitely a little bit jaded by the experience.
Okay.
Maybe I need to go and speak to my therapist about this.
Yeah, look, these guys could end up being the AOL of the early internet.
Yes.
And, you've got to keep that in mind with these things. And they may not. They may have cracked it. They were the first on the scene, it seems, and at least for what the public think is AI, is ChatGPT.
Yeah.
So they've captured people's imagination that way. But, there were early search engines, and then Google cracked it. And somebody else might this whole thing wide open in a way that we don't really quite understand, that it might not be the chat style thing that works. It might actually be something completely different. I don't know what, but and that could change everything. It could be a device, for example.
It might be the rabbit device.
It won't be the rabbit. There's no way anybody's getting a big chunkier phone. It makes no sense whatsoever.
I still don't get it. I don't get it. I'm waiting for an aha moment, but I don't get it.
I don't get it at all.
It's very strange.
Very strange, that one.
Yeah.
But again, the same. So hang on, just going back to the topic of what we're talking about today. So with Rabbit, for example, where are they getting their AI machine engine from, right? Because a lot of these smaller players are going to be like using Google data in the past, are going to be using OpenAI data. So they're caught up in all the same problem, right?
Yep.
They're not really, apart from the device, doing anything else with this AI thing.
And this is where it all kind of unravels, because AI has to be taught on something, and if you're not allowed to, or it's too expensive to teach on things, then that raises a whole other thing. If it becomes too expensive to train on certain, New York Times, for example, then you have to train on other things, and then you're going to get slightly skewed learning.
You might also get slightly less skewed learning. We're going to do a whole podcast on this, but the biases of AI, of course, a big problem, and least of all with women in terms of what they use, because it's well known that a lot of the modelling for medical trials, for example, which ChatGPT and others will be mining from, are skewed to men because men are easier to test. Women are frankly more complex on a lot of things to test on, and so they don't. And so we're skewing a lot of knowledge that we've got in the world. That's just one example, a lot of knowledge towards men. And of course, then there's the whole race thing, and you get into whether or not the data that they're being trained on is fair at all. And so if you're male, white, aged between 25 and 40, then it's going to feel perfectly normal, a lot of the searches. But if you're not any of those things, then the whole thing feels a bit weird and like you're in a different universe. And that's something we should tackle in another episode. But it comes up when in terms of what you tell about the sort of the data that people are paying to get used. And maybe if paying for it means that we end up with other sources, but that may be a good thing.
Maybe better.
Should we leave
Can I
it there
tell you
today?
just one last little... Can I just tell you a funny little thing that I read about over the break? So it was becoming noticed that the results from ChatGPT over Christmas and the New York kind of December time were slower. The kind of responses were slower in terms of how quickly they came back, and also just not quite as good as they were slightly earlier in the year. And it turns out that because it's been trained on, squillions of data, people generally that produce the data that trains things like OpenAI are generally slightly less productive from about the start of December through to mid-January because it's the Christmas break. And OpenAI had learnt that this is what happens just from looking at the volume of content and things like that, and hence why you were not getting such good results during Christmas and New Year.
How interesting. So it is basically that really does highlight the fact that it is just a reflection of us, our collective knowledge, more than anything, isn't it? And in real time. Not just,
literally.
We'll scrape a whole lot of Shakespeare plays and Chaucer plays and then put them together into a new story. No, it's in real time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm glad
Happy Christmas, ChatGPT.
I'm glad ChatGPT gets a break over Christmas because it gets a hell of a time.
You've all got to have a rest.
You've all got to have a rest.
No one talks about that.
Resistance is futile.